It makes me very happy that you stayed within time. Now we're going to listen to René Miñón, Venezuela. He has a PhD from the Torino University. He's a researcher level 3 of the National Researcher System. He studies actors and social processes. Among his main areas of study, we have social performance, government reliability, social theory in Mexico. He's written two books on New Order in the Mexican society and state reform and social coordination. Together with other researchers, he's also written chapters and papers and conducted specialized interviews. And what he's going to speak of today is what subjective refers to in well-being. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your kind invitation. I feel very happy to be here with all of you. I'd like to thank, first of all, Mariano. He is bringing me much happiness today, and also Flaxo, with whom I've worked closely for a long time. Mariano wanted me to intervene and speak particularly of what subjectivity is here. Okay, if you could please bring up the PowerPoint. I'm somewhat technologically illiterate, so sorry for this. And I found this very interesting because when it comes from international flows, and this depends a bit on cultural traditions that exist in each country. The issue of subjectivity has been poorly received in academic traditions. You said it, and you said it very clearly. Well, because subjectivity is seen as something that denies or is different or presents a dichotomy to objectivity. On the other hand, because subjectivity tends, in the case of Latin America, to collective subjects, and this helps understand that the public sphere of social life can only be thought from policy and not from the individual per se. This is a very long existing Latin American tradition, whereas subjective well-being refers to the individual. This generates skepticism with regards to the concept of happiness. The UNDP's report on Chile's subjective well-being warned that it was important to give certain importance to this, because in parallel to economic attempts, there was an international industry of happiness, where you can find a series of proposals and ways and such. So it was important to consolidate this in terms of discipline. So this is passing through an important reflection on what subjectivity is, and for this. So that's why I'm going to have a very brief intervention, because it's not like I have too much to say about what subjectivity is. I want to mention a few of the things that were mentioned in the Latin American conference that was also coordinated by Ivan. Okay, so what can you listen to me well? Okay, so what does subjective mean? What advantages does it have, and what reaches does it have as a conceptual instrument? As part of the commitments that appeared after the Latin American Conference for measuring well-being and promoting the progress of societies, the INEGI was asking, okay, when we speak of subjectivity, we need to determine if a person has certain satisfying elements, and if we add subjective, what are we referring to? So it implicitly referred to something different from acquiring certain capacities, so it's something different. So we could say that what's subjective refers to the subject, to the point of view of that subject. So briefly, the unit between well-being and subjectivity refers to the experience of a subject towards certain goods, certain actions, certain social environment or personal environments, and it refers therefore to the evaluation that we're conducting. So I'll repeat this: the evaluation that is done. The subjective well-being does not refer to the objectivity of the goods or the dimensions of this relation, but to the experience or how that person values. It's not education or marriage per se, but the experience of these things. Subjectivity refers Subjective refers to well-being a well-being that can only be determined through the subject or individual's experience. It's not an imputation of a academic, militant leader, politician, or priest does as a result of certain qualities of certain objects or goods or relations or context. However, even though there are different positions on this, sustaining the previous paragraph implies a generalized approach. Okay, premises: it's undeniable that each person has privileged access to his own subjectivity. No one knows how somebody is doing better than oneself. So no one has a better mechanism to access subjectivity than the subject. So it's not methodologically sustainable to value the person's own life. It's not a third person. So these are elements. Academics, well, we have horizons, and we think we know what good societies are, and that leads to us having highly normative behaviors towards other social subjects, and this irritates other Latin American traditions. There is not an external viewpoint that's better than the one the individual uses to evaluate his life experiences. So it's not necessarily good to prescribe a universal paradigm that will evaluate a person's well-being. So this is a hermeneutic or anthropologic position. We need to respect how certain people or tribes, etc., understand their life. We need to understand other people's logics. We can't force a logic from the outside, and therefore that's how we should understand subjective well-being. Well-being is very close to what's relevant to people, and this relevance can change from individual to individual, from context to context. A person's experience of their own life is subjective. However, well-being is also subjective by nature. If people don't experiment it, if they don't experiment this subjectively, then it doesn't exist. In this sense, it would be strange to think we can speak of subjective well-being. However, we can speak of objective variables that can help us measure the necessary elements for well-being. However, well-being is either subjective or it doesn't exist. It's necessarily subjective then. So what's subjective doesn't mean that people can't have social or political relations towards certain things or to certain areas of action. What's subjective is the way they value this relation. And we assume that the criteria used for this are valid because the subject deems them to be so. In this sense, subjective well-being can be analyzed as a result of a person's relation with their areas of action and experience, which should be their job or family. B, cultural objects or dimensions, for instance, religion or other mystical practices. C, social objects or dimensions, for instance, the quality of the links people have with other people, for instance, social networks, or D, objects or political dimensions, institutional contexts. E, intimate experiences such as hedonistic experiences, and F, objects that determine quality of life, for instance, transportation, services, poverty. If subjective well-being ought to be related with personal and social variables, we need another variable which allows measurement. Despite their differences, the notions of happiness and life satisfaction serve this function. Therefore, we need a variable that we can operate and research. Sometimes it is happiness, sometimes it is life satisfaction. As in all field of research and analysis, there may be problems of conceptualization and measurement. So we can ask ourselves if we need to make better measurements and such, but what's clear are two methodological operations which refer to subjective well-being. What subjective refers to the specific values of variables. The subject evaluates. B is what's objective to association patterns or its relation with other variables, and this occurs in many other studies. Okay, what advantages does this present? Well, there's two very robust reasons that have imposed subjective well-being as a central dimension. First of all, there's more and more evidence that classic indicators such as GDP and income or economic growth do not necessarily lead to an increase in the well-being of individuals. And the second is that these macro variables with which progress is identified are not translated into a well-being of persons. So what his well-being has identified is the difference, is the gap between well-being and and progress. So, and specialists said this, it's not automatic or face-to-face. So in this gap between progress and well-being, the commission presided by Stiglitz, it was a commission made by the French government, and because they were spending a lot of money, well, they said that in the common use of statistics is not capturing this. Oh, forgot to change the slide. Okay, here it is. The common use of a statistic is not capturing this phenomena, and this is having a growing impact on citizen well-being. For instance, traffic can increase the GDP from use of gas, but not quality of life. Therefore, statistic measures that ignore pollution will give us an inadequate measure of what's happening in citizen well-being. GDP is not a mistake. It's just being used the wrong way. We can also speak of cases in which we have high income and excellent work, but bad health or an absence of affection. And well, this shows the distance between certain indicators and the well-being of individuals. If this distance occurs, there's an issue of how to measure this well-being. How? Well, by collecting the people's opinion. So in this sense, subjective well-being serves to attain a more complex idea of what well-being is, and therefore the measurement is a conceptual effort to redefine the classical basis through which progress has been measured. And I would like to add one thing, that performance of that well-being can serve to understand how a society is developing. We have a series of indicators for measuring economic performance or parliamentary performance, but we have very few indicators for social performance, and subjective well-being could serve for that. So it serves for three things. Well, it opens a new methodology, perhaps, and a new theoretical frameworks for Latin America. And these results have also made us think some of the important relations of classical sciences, for instance, the relation between income and happiness, income and certain political behavior. Subjective well-being is introducing variables that change the relationship paradigms we used to assume is true. Another thing is that this concept can bring together a new vision on poverty and also incorporate certain new fields for research, such as sustainable environment, social inclusion. The World Report on Happiness of 2000 says that happiness, the subjective well-being, is important for understanding the sustainable development. Also, well, public policy, the concept allows to redefine and to define from a beginning and improve public policies. This hasn't been done. It needs to be improved, but of course, because of positive and negative externalities, it should be considered. And these are the three areas. Conceptually, it's a new field. It allows to redefine a series of sub-disciplines in terms of progress, and also to elaborate new policies. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Millán. Our next panelist, Dr. Roberto Castellanos. Roberto Castellanos is a professor at the School of Political Sciences of the National University. He has his PhD in political science, and he studies subjective well-being. He's also an associate researcher at the Fundación Este País. He's a member of the Commission for the Study and Promotion of Well-being in Latin America. He's been a consultant for different international organizations, including the UN and UNICEF. He's written books. He as a co-author on many of the subjects discussed today. Many of his papers have been published in academic journals and also general magazines. And Professor Castellanos will speak today of the initiatives for subjective well-being at the government level in different Latin American countries. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for calling me a PhD, but that's still something I'm working on. And I hope I'm formally a doctorate soon, but I'm still not there yet. I first of all want to thank the INEGI, the Flaxo, for organizing this forum, and of course the opportunity to share some of what I've been working on in previous months and years. I would especially want to thank Mariano Rojas for his invitation, and I would of course like to congratulate him for his leadership, because he, together with many, but he specifically has been able to promote this subject, which I think is evidently very important and of great transcendence. It's important to be able to publicly discuss the matter. Something which what I want to share with you is fundamentally certain elements which I'd like to share on what the positions, debates, and ideas discussed internationally are in terms of subjective well-being. And I divide it in two big discussions. One has to do with the global or regional discussions, which has four initiatives. I'm going to focus on three of them. One is the ODCE, the Stiglitz Commission, Sin Fitoussi Commission, which should be considered national, but its impact is so large that I think we should consider it internationally, because it was promoted by the then government of Sarkozy in 2008. And the third space is the United Nations, and finally the European Commission, which has worked on this. The second area has to do with national initiatives in different countries, mostly those being promoted by governments, not those being promoted from civil society or other spaces in the private sector, for instance. That they have many interesting ones, but I will only be presenting the results and analysis that have to do with government initiatives, and I'll be measuring some general patterns for the types of concepts, types of measurements, types of uses in public policy. An important issue which has to do with developing a measure for well-being and subjective well-being in particular.
The OECD, since 2007 with the Declaration of Istanbul, has summoned us to start thinking on the progress of nations. What does it mean for nations in the 20th century, and also incorporate this in public policies. And with a very special emphasis on the fact that public policies should be based on indicators and statistics. To a great extent, this contributes to this trend that is public policy based on evidence. The OECD has made an important statement in this regard. And also, they launched the Better Life Index that, well, for many of you who have used this tool, this gives us an idea of the quality of life, how it should be measured. And it also talks about the multiple dimensions of the quality of life. Another milestones are the guidelines to measure subjective well-being. These are some of the milestones. Of course, there have been several fora about statistics, public policy, where we have discussed these topics and we've made progress. Some of the positions that the OECD has presented to this regard are related to emphasizing that we, well, the societies, the countries, the governments have to measure the quality of life and not only the material well-being. And quality of life is one of the central topics in the OECD's position. And we have to promote economic growth and also social progress. We need to conceptualize and measure social progress as well. The reason of having better measurements is to have better policies. It's not only about measuring, only for measuring, but this should be useful and oriented to public policies. And one of the criteria is to measure what matters most to people. The second global forum is the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission that started working and issued its report. And I think this is important because the report says us in the context of the most important economic financial crisis in the world, in the contemporary life. And they mention this, and there are a set of indicators that are guiding the public policy and are leading us to decisions in a wrong manner. So this includes three scopes. We have to read the indicators related to economic performance, not only measuring production but also consumption and income. It reiterates the importance of quality of life and also emphasizes that it should be measured in its objective and subjective dimensions. And one of its recommendations, the recommendation 10 of the final report of the Commission, says that it's necessary to include all the dimensions possible to measure subjective well-being. It's not only focused on a single one. And another element is that it's necessary to incorporate the dimension of sustainability and environment. There's a phrase that has been repeated a lot, and it encompasses the importance of incorporating subjective well-being measurements and also review the existing measures and those that orient public policy. Is that what we measure affects what we do, and if we change what we measure, we can reorient what we are doing. That's the importance of seeing what and how we are measuring. The UN chronologically started with this later on, but it's been done in a very open and direct manner. In 2011, it issued a ruling where it urges to measure happiness and well-being within their policies. And the national statistics offices should measure this. In January of this year, it issued a synthesis of the scope of the results they have to date with regard to subjective well-being and happiness, and it says that happiness should be considered as the holistic approach of development. Also linked to the work that many other agencies of the UN are performing. And then it makes some recommendations to have a broader concept of well-being to change the paradigm. There should be a periodical collection of information about happiness, similar to what the OECD says. They should improve the public policies and decision-making, and it makes two recommendations at the end that are relevant. It suggests to build an evaluation system to assess the policies according to the change in subjective well-being. So how much subjective well-being changes according to the expenditure of governments. And the last element, which is central for countries like Mexico, with very numerous sectors of people who live in poverty and marginalization, measured in different manners. They say that before starting measuring and also influencing public policy, those actions oriented to people in poverty conditions, we need to guarantee minimum conditions for happiness. Just as Diener had explained that from certain level of income, well, before certain level of income, an additional peso and an additional dollar makes a substantial difference, but afterwards not. So that previous space are the minimum conditions that need to exist. I'm sorry about my voice. Now I continue to the national experiences regarding subjective well-being from the government perspective. I can identify 15. We have some countries that are not mentioned, but I understand they're working on this topic. As I say, this is an ongoing research, particularly New Zealand. Qatar is working also on this, but these are some of the countries which are more significant. Just to mention a few, there are some countries that have more than one initiative or more than one space where they are discussing new measures of well-being in general that include subjective well-being, like Germany has a commission, the Bundestag, where they are discussing this issue. They had reached conclusions slightly different from another ministerial French-German commission. In Australia, there are two spaces where this is being discussed, and we could go country by country. China, it's interesting because nationwide there's no initiative, but at the province level there are some attempts to define happiness indexes in order to measure the performance, not only the economic performance of the provinces, but also the performance of the societies and how this can affect the career of some officials. The Stiglitz Commission mentions this as a part of a national initiative in France. Italy, I think, is one of the most outstanding cases regarding the depth with which they have defined indicators and analyzed them. Their initiative is called Equitable and Sustainable Wellbeing. The UK is another important initiative with a very broad process of discussion. And also, there are other cases like Malaysia with 2 initiatives and Thailand. Very briefly, what are some of the common characteristics from this set of countries that are fostering these initiatives? Well, these are countries with a medium and high development on average. Evidently, within the countries there could be differences. These are societies that are homogeneous relatively. There's a concern about the environment. To redefine the concept of progress, there's also concern about the environment and sustainability, and there's also several of these countries, since they have a medium and high income and have been affected by the economic crisis, not only the one of 2008, but also the one in the 90s, like Thailand, and the Asian tigers were severely affected. Well, with my remaining time, I will mention some general perspectives I can identify, or some commonalities of these initiatives. First, there's a lot of enthusiasm to reach a new form to find the well-being, not only subjective well-being, but also measure progress. But specifically in subjective well-being is very careful, because we need to collect all the information, the different ways to measure the hedonic, cognitive well-being, all the kinds of well-being. But we are going to see little by little how we can incorporate this into the public policy. That's what I mean with this careful enthusiasm. Is there any concept of subjective well-being that predominates? Mainly the life satisfaction one is the most used one, both the general one and by vital domains. I'll go back to this later on, but this is the predominant one. We also have the hedonic concept of happiness, but I think this is more related to the speech, because it's easier to connect with the society when we say that there's an indicator of happiness, because of the reasons René was saying. There's less resistance because you identify more yourself with this, and this could be a useful communication tool. If we see how we are measuring subjective well-being in these countries, most of them establish a kind of division of vital domains. This is an exercise that has been done for many years in the academy. This shows certain functional differentiation in the societies, and it's expressed this way in the measurements. It's also talks about the multiple dimensions and the transversality of subjective well-being. The list that you can see on the screen is the number of occasions in which one of these domains is incorporated in one of the national measures. The most present one is income or life standards. 16 of the national measures incorporate this as a vital domain, and in 8 of the initiatives that we analyzed include subjective well-being as a domain itself, but also subjective well-being is measured in some of the other domains as a subjective well-being of that domain. I'll go faster. In the last 2 slides I have, there's a discussion whether whether creating indexes or indicators. For instance, in the case of Italy, it has up to 134 indicators. They don't want to build an index, but there are many other cases in which they are willing to build an index. It has its cons and pros. The index is appealing in terms that it is a synthesis. It's a tool with a lot of strength in terms of communication, like the Human Development Index. It reduces the complexity from the perspective of analysts and academics. It's a disadvantage. Whether the Board of Indicators, it preserves the nuances but increases complexity. So this is present in the public discussion. Types of uses in public policies. I'm talking about the potential uses, except for the case of planning development, because there are many countries, particularly in Asia, that are incorporating this in their 5-year plans. I mean, the indexes or elements of subjective well-being or approaches of subjective well-being to define the indicators that we're going to use. But also we can use, it is defined that the potential uses are in the design, monitoring, and assessment of the public policy, and also the cost-benefit analysis, which I've already mentioned.
Hay un par de puntos
There's a couple of final points this is only a reflection, is that the measurement of subjective well-being as any other measurement can be considered a public good. Many countries treat this as something for the public interest, so there should be a broad citizen participation, and people should be asked not only in surveys but in the focus groups, should be part of a process of deliberation. And the case of the UK is a study case quite important. It's not the only one, but it's very important. The measures should be considered as an element to monitor the citizens and to empower them, not only for public policies, and for the citizens, so that the governments are held accountable, and also so that the citizens may know how to improve their well-being. And finally, we have a couple of conceptual tensions under discussion globally. The theory of capacities versus subjective well-being, and individual well-being versus social well-being. So this is clearly reflected on the Human Development Report, and it's also being discussed whether the theory of capacity is better than subjective well-being. This is a tension because they are not opposing elements, but it forms part of public forum. Sorry, I exceeded by 2 minutes.